Somewhere in this city, right now, a woman is sitting at a glass table with her phone in her hand, reading a message for the third time. There's no name attached to it. No greeting, no emojis, no explanation, no context. Just a time and a location, typed out in plain text as though whoever sent it already knew she was coming and didn't need to try any harder than that. She should put the phone down. She should delete the message and go to bed and forget that she ever saw it. But she doesn't do that. Instead, she sets the phone down carefully, picks up her lipstick, finishes getting ready, and walks out the door. And that single decision, that one small, quiet, completely ordinary-looking decision, is the last, truly free choice she will ever make. Stay with me. Because this is a story about a woman who spent her entire life believing she was the most dangerous person in every room she walked into. A woman who had rules and systems and a version of herself so carefully constructed that she genuinely believed nothing could touch her. Tonight, we are going to find out what happens when someone untouchable finally meets something that doesn't care. Before we dive into this story, if you're new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this. And down in the comments, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Are you watching from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, South Africa, Jamaica, or somewhere else entirely? It's always amazing seeing how far these stories travel, and how many people around the world are watching together. Now, let's get into the story. She didn't believe in love. Not the kind people posted online with long captions and matching outfits and declarations that were clearly written for an audience, rather than for the person they were supposedly addressed to. Not the kind that came with promises and late-night calls and the particular desperation of someone who needed you to feel something back. No, Victoria had looked at all of that a long time ago, and made a decision that most people were too afraid to make out loud. She decided that love was a liability, that it made people soft and distracted and vulnerable in ways that cost them dearly. And she decided she wanted absolutely no part of it. What she believed in instead was something far more reliable. Something that had never once let her down, never once changed its mind about her, never once woke up one morning and decided she wasn't worth it anymore. She believed in money. And before you judge that, before you write her off as shallow or cold or broken, I want you to understand something. Victoria had reasons for being the way she was. She had a history the way all of us do, a collection of moments and realizations and particular kinds of pain that had quietly shaped her into the woman she became. She wasn't born without a heart. She had simply decided somewhere along the way that the world didn't deserve access to it, and she had built accordingly. Her name was Victoria, and if you saw her walking into a restaurant, any occasion, you would notice her immediately. Not because she was loud, not because she demanded attention in the way that insecure people do, making noise and taking up space and performing confidence for whoever happened to be watching. Victoria was the opposite of that entirely. She was quiet in the way that truly powerful things are quiet. Everything about her looked expensive without trying. The heels, the bag, the particular way she moved through a room like she had already decided she owned it and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up to something she had resolved minutes ago. Victoria didn't chase men. She chose them. There is an enormous difference between those two things, and she understood it better than almost anyone. Chasing was desperate. Chasing meant you needed something from someone and had put yourself in the position of hoping they would give it to you. Choosing meant you were in control. It meant you had evaluated your options, made a clear decision based on criteria you had established yourself, and moved forward on your own terms without asking anyone's permission. That was how Victoria operated. Always. In every area of her life. But nowhere more deliberately and nowhere more precisely than in the area of men. She had rules, strict ones that she had built over years of trial and error, refined through experience, tested against reality until they were as close to airtight as human engineering could make them. Never date a man who asks too many questions about your past, because that kind of man is building a case, collecting information, constructing a version of you he intends to use against you eventually. Never stay longer than necessary, because the longer you stay, the more you become familiar. And familiarity creates the specific kind of attachment that makes it difficult to leave cleanly and on your own terms. And most importantly, the rule she had carved into the deepest part of herself and returned to every single morning like a talisman she needed to touch before the day could begin. Never fall in love. Never. Under any circumstances. No matter what he says or how he says it or how different it feels from anything that came before it. Never. To Victoria, relationships were transactions. Clean, simple, clearly defined exchanges that everyone involved understood the nature of, whether they admitted it or not. You give attention and time and the particular warmth of a woman who has decided to choose you. You receive comfort and security and the kind of financial ease that most people spend their whole lives chasing without ever quite catching. Simple, clean, controlled. No confusion, no false expectations, no one ending up hurt because everyone knew from the beginning exactly what they were getting. At least, that was how she saw it. That was the story she had been telling herself for 6 years. And nothing had happened yet to challenge it in any way that mattered. Her phone buzzed one Tuesday evening while she was sitting on her apartment balcony, a glass of wine in her hand, watching the city move below her with the particular satisfaction of a person who feels exactly where they are supposed to be. She didn't rush to check it. She never rushed for anything or anyone. Control was everything, and control meant not reacting, not jumping, not letting anything see that it had startled you. She let it buzz, picked up her wine, took a slow sip, set the glass down with the same unhurried deliberateness she brought to everything. And then, only then, when she was ready, she looked down at the screen. 3 messages. 3 different names. The first one said dinner tonight with a question mark. The casual kind of invitation that assumed she had no better options waiting. The second said, I miss you, which was the kind of message Victoria found both predictable and faintly embarrassing. The emotional equivalent of a man leaving his front door open and hoping you would notice and come in on your own. The third said, I sent something to your account. Victoria ignored the first 2 without a second thought. She opened the third. The transfer notification sat there on the screen, precise and cold, and exactly what she had expected. She set the phone down. She smiled. Not because she was happy. Victoria was rarely what most people would describe as happy. Not because anything about this produced warmth in her. She smiled because she was right. Again, as always, this was her world. Luxury dinners in places that didn't take walk-ins, late-night drives in cars that belonged to men who believed this made them impressive, gifts that arrived without warning in the right size and the right color, because she had mentioned things in passing and the men around her had learned to pay very careful attention. Men always thought they were in control. They thought that because they had the money and the cars and the reservations that they were the architects of whatever this was, that they were the ones setting the terms. They weren't. They had never been. Victoria was always the one holding the blueprint. She simply made sure they never saw it. And this is the thing about women like Victoria that most people miss when they're too busy reacting to the surface of who she was. She didn't see herself as a gold digger. She didn't see herself as predatory or manipulative or cruel. She saw herself as a woman who had figured out how the world actually worked and had made the rational decision to operate accordingly. She had looked at the rules everyone else was playing by. Be vulnerable, be open, give people your heart and hope they are careful with it. And she had decided those were rules for people who could afford the losses that followed. Victoria had decided she could not afford to lose. Not again. So she had changed the game. And for 6 years, without exception, she won. Until the night she didn't. It started on a Wednesday. She had been having an ordinary evening by her standards, polished and deliberate and entirely on her own terms, when the invitation arrived. No greeting, no emojis, no long message designed to intrigue her or convince her of anything. Just a time and a location. A restaurant she had never heard of, on a street she recognized but had never paid close attention to. She almost didn't go. She told herself it was because she had better things to do, which was probably true, but the real reason she almost didn't go was something she would not have admitted to anyone, not even herself. Something about the message made her feel slightly off balance. Not afraid, not excited. Something she didn't have a name for yet. Something that lived just underneath the part of her brain that ran on rules and strategy, in the older, quieter part that ran on instinct. That part was paying attention. She told it to be quiet. And then she finished getting ready and went. When she arrived, the restaurant was quieter than she expected. Not the cultivated quiet of a place exclusive enough to feel empty, but a different kind of quiet. A stillness that seemed to exist independently of the soft music playing in the background, as though the music itself was secondary to something larger and more present in the room. The lighting was dim and golden, and the kind of beautiful that makes you feel watched without being able to explain exactly why. Victoria stood in the entrance for a moment and did what she always did: observed, read the room before committing to it, and that was when she saw him. He was sitting at a table at the far end of the room, alone, not with a phone in his hand, the way men usually waited. Not performing distraction, because the vulnerability of simply waiting felt too uncomfortable to sit with. Not checking the door every few seconds with that particular anxious energy of someone who needed confirmation you were actually coming. He was just there. Still. Calm. Looking directly at her, not because she had just walked in and drawn his attention, but in the way you look at something you have been expecting for a while and are simply watching arrive. Victoria paused, just for a second, an involuntary thing, the kind of pause her body made before her mind could override it. Something in her chest felt unfamiliar. Not fear. Not the cold, sharp thing she sometimes felt in rooms with genuinely dangerous men. Not excitement, something quieter and stranger than either of those things. She sealed it away behind 6 years of careful construction and walked toward him. Confident, controlled, untouchable. The way she always walked into rooms that mattered. He said her name before she reached the table. Not as a question, not with the rising inflection of someone checking they had the right person, but as a flat and certain statement. Victoria. The way you say something you have always known. She stopped just short of the chair and looked at him directly. How do you know my name? She asked. He leaned back slightly in the manner of someone making themselves comfortable, settling in for something they had no intention of rushing. I know a lot about you, he said. And Victoria, the woman who always had a response, who had spent years sharpening her conversation into something precise and unrattleable, for the first time in a very long time had absolutely nothing to say. She didn't sit down immediately. She stood there a moment longer than was strictly necessary, which for Victoria was an eternity, studying him the way she studied every room and every person she encountered before committing to them. Observe first, act later. That was the principle she had lived by for years, and it had never once failed her. She was looking for the tells, the particular combination of signals that would tell her who this man was at his core, what he wanted, how he operated, and where his edges were. Every person had edges. Corners that were sharper than the rest, places where the polish wore thin and the real thing underneath showed through. She was very good at finding them in other people. With him, she couldn't find them. And that, more than anything else about that first evening, was what unsettled her. He wasn't performing. He wasn't leaning forward with the eager energy of a man who needed her to be impressed. He wasn't talking too fast, or showing off in the subtle ways men showed off when they wanted something. He wasn't filling the silence because the quiet felt like judgment. He was just sitting there. Still. Patient. Like a man who had already accounted for every possible version of how this conversation could go, and was simply waiting to see which one she chose. That kind of stillness wasn't reassurance. That kind of stillness, in Victoria's considerable experience with people, was a warning. She sat down anyway. I want you to pay close attention to something here, because this detail matters more than it seems. The powerful men Victoria had encountered throughout her life, the successful ones, the ones who sat at the top of whatever world they had built for themselves, almost all of them had something to prove when they were in a room with a woman like her. They wanted her to know about the properties and the cars and the accounts. They wanted her to understand exactly what she was in the presence of. This man had none of that. He didn't need her to be impressed. He didn't appear to need anything from her at all. And a man who doesn't need you to be impressed is a man who already has what he came for. Victoria just hadn't figured out yet what that was. She pulled out the chair and sat down slowly, crossing her legs in that particular deliberate way she had, unhurried, composed, a silent declaration of her own control over the moment. "You invited me," she said, keeping her voice smooth and measured the way she always did. "But you haven't said why." He lifted his glass, took a slow sip, and placed it back down without hurry. There was no sense that the passage of time cost him anything. "I wanted to see if you'd come," he said simply. Victoria raised an eyebrow. "That's it?" A small pause. Not the pause of someone considering their answer, but of someone choosing the exact right moment to deliver the one they already had. "Yes," he said. She let out a soft, almost amused breath and reached slightly for her bag. A test. She had used that move 100 times on other people. Leave the door open just enough that the other person feels the pressure of potentially losing you and shows their hand. See how they respond. "Sit," he said. The word was not loud, not aggressive, not theatrical the way some men performed authority, raising their voice to make up for the weight they lacked, but it carried something. Real weight. The kind that comes from a person so genuinely accustomed to being obeyed that they have long since stopped performing the act of authority and simply inhabit it. Victoria froze for just a moment. Not because she was afraid. Not because she felt any particular inclination to do what he said, but because she hadn't been spoken to like that, with that specific quiet certainty, in a very long time, and something in her responded to it before her mind had the chance to get in front of it. She leaned back slowly. Not obeying, she told herself firmly. Just curious. "Careful," she said quietly. "You don't know me well enough to give orders." He tilted his head slightly, the faintest movement, something between amusement and consideration. "Don't I?" he replied. Silence settled between them, comfortable on his side and considerably less comfortable on hers. Then he leaned forward just a little, not enough to cross any line but enough to shift the energy of the entire table in a way she felt physically. "You prefer older men," he said calmly. "Successful. Predictable. Generous." Victoria's expression didn't change. She had trained herself over years to keep her face exactly where she wanted it, revealing nothing she hadn't consciously decided to reveal. But inside something tightened, a small involuntary contraction. "You never stay longer than 3 months," he continued. "You avoid emotional conversations at all costs. You never answer calls after midnight unless there's money involved. You don't return to the same restaurant twice. And you have never once let a man see you cry." Victoria stared at him fully now. No pretending to be unbothered, because that itself would have been a tell. She simply looked at him and asked the most direct question available. "Who are you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he continued as though she hadn't spoken. "I also know," he added softly, "that you almost didn't come tonight." That hit in a specific and irreducible way. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was true, precisely and completely true. And the only way he could have known it was if he had been watching her for long enough to understand not just her patterns, but her hesitations. Her private moments. The small internal battles no one else was supposed to see. The version of her that existed when no one was looking. I need you to understand what Victoria was processing in that moment. Because this wasn't a man who had done some research. This wasn't someone who had spoken to her friends or dug through her social media or hired a private investigator who had put together a file. This was a man who knew her. Not the version she curated for the world. Not the heels and the rules and the transfer notifications. The real version. The one that almost didn't come that night because something felt wrong and she couldn't explain it. The one that had rules because the one without rules had been hurt in ways she had never fully told anyone about. He knew that version. And for a woman who had spent 6 years making sure nobody ever got close enough to see that version, having it named out loud across a dinner table in a restaurant she had never heard of, was not just uncomfortable. It was the most exposed she had felt in years. She asked him directly whether he had hired someone to follow her. He said no, with that same calm certainty he brought to everything. And when she pushed further, he delivered the sentence that lodged itself in her chest and stayed there the rest of the evening. "You're predictable." Not as a taunt. Not with cruelty. Just as a flat and neutral statement, the way you might note the color of a wall. "Everyone is predictable," he continued. "They just don't like hearing it." The waiter arrived then, and the man ordered for her without consulting her. Simply said she'd have the usual in the tone of someone who already knew what that was. And when Victoria told him sharply that she hadn't ordered anything, he said only she'll like it, and moved on as though the matter was settled. And the maddening thing, the thing she filed away and refused to examine too closely, was that when the food arrived, she did like it. Exactly. The conversation that followed was unlike any she had experienced across 6 years of strategic dining with powerful men. He didn't perform, didn't deploy wit or sophistication, or the social theater she had watched men put on her entire adult life when they were trying to impress someone. He simply talked and listened, and watched her with those still, patient eyes that gave nothing back and collected everything. And slowly, with terrible precision, he laid out for her everything he had observed about who she was and how she moved through the world. Not as an accusation, as a demonstration. "Look how completely you have already been seen. Look how little I need to ask because I already know." When he finally told her he wanted to make her an offer, she was paying complete attention for the first time in the evening without performing attention. "Not a date," he said. "Not a relationship. A deal." That word landed like a key in a lock she hadn't realized existed. She knew that word. That word was her language. That word was the cleanest, most honest framing of what she had been doing for 6 years, while everyone around her complicated it with feelings and expectations and the messy human need for more than what the arrangement actually was. "Stay with me for 1 month," he said. "No games. No other men. No lies." And he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone and placed it on the table and turned the screen toward her. Victoria looked down at the screen. And for the first time that evening, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, her composure cracked. Just slightly, just a fraction, just enough that she felt it moving through her like a hairline fracture in something she had believed was solid. The number was larger than anything a single person had ever offered her. Not marginally larger, significantly, life-alteringly. The kind of number that doesn't just change a conversation but rewrites the entire context in which the conversation is happening. Her eyes moved back up to his face. "You're serious," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Very," he replied. Her mind ran the calculation fast the way it always ran calculations, the one skill she had never had to manufacture because it had always been there. 1 month. No emotional negotiation. No pretending to feel things she didn't feel. A clearly defined term, and a clearly defined payment, which was more honest than half the relationships she had observed people she knew sustaining for years under the polite fiction that they were something other than what they were. It was everything she claimed to want. The cleanest, most explicit version of the system she had built her life around. And yet something she could not locate or name, felt wrong. Too perfect, too prepared. Too much like the offer wasn't the actual point, and she was. She asked him why her. He answered immediately. "Because you're the only one who thinks she can't be controlled." Those words settled over her cold and specific. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached forward, turned the phone back toward him, and told him 1 month. But she leaned in close before she pulled away and said it quietly enough that only he could hear it. "I don't lose." He held her gaze the way he had held it all evening, steady and patient, and like a man watching something unfold that he has already seen the ending of. And then he replied, very quietly, in that voice that carried weight, without needing volume. "We'll see." Victoria didn't sleep well that first night. She lay in her own bed, staring at the ceiling, and turned the evening over in her mind, the way you turn a strange object in your hands, looking for the angle that makes it ordinary, the logic that explains it into something manageable. She had met powerful men before. Men with the kind of money and self-possession that filled a room before they walked into it. Men who were accustomed to the world rearranging itself around their preferences. But none of them had ever felt like this. None of them had ever studied her the way he had, catalogued her with that quiet, clinical precision, as though she were a subject in an experiment whose outcome he had already logged before she arrived. What unsettled her most was not what he had said, but what he had not said. He had not explained himself, had not told her who he was or where his money came from, or what he did or why he wanted this particular arrangement with this particular woman, beyond the answer he had already given her, which she knew, without being able to prove it, was not the complete truth. He had given her just enough to be genuinely interested, and had withheld everything that would have provided real information. And Victoria, who was exceptionally good at extracting information from people, who had made an art form of it across years of careful practice, had left that restaurant knowing almost nothing concrete about the man she had just agreed to spend a month with. That was not how she operated. It had never been how she operated. And lying in the dark, staring at the ceiling, she turned that fact over and over and could not make it feel like anything other than what it was. There is a specific kind of discomfort that comes when you are very good at reading people and you encounter someone you genuinely cannot read. It doesn't feel like admiration. It doesn't feel like the pleasant challenge of a puzzle. It feels like standing at the edge of something deep and looking down and not being able to see the bottom. Victoria had spent 6 years developing the ability to see the bottom of every person she encountered. She knew what people wanted, knew what they feared, knew the particular shape of the gap between how they presented themselves and who they actually were underneath. This man had no visible bottom. She had looked for it all evening and found nothing, and that, more than the money or the deal or the way he had known her name, was the thing that kept her awake. The next morning she woke to a message. No greeting, no name, just a time, 8 in the evening, and an address. She stared at it for a moment, then locked her phone and set it face down on the nightstand. He was consistent. She had to give him that. There was something almost architectural about the precision of his communication, the complete and deliberate absence of anything unnecessary. Most men in his position, men who were trying to maintain a woman's interest across the space between one meeting and the next, would have sent something warmer, would have referenced the evening before, would have padded the invitation with something personal that said, "I was thinking about you." He sent a time and an address, nothing else, and somehow that restraint communicated more than a long, warm message would have. It said, "I am not trying to manage how you feel about this. I am simply telling you where to be." By evening she was ready, hair flawless, outfit chosen with her usual precision, nothing too loud, nothing that tried too hard, just the particular combination of expensive and effortless that she had spent years perfecting until it looked like she hadn't thought about it at all. The car arrived at 7:30 exactly. No introduction from the driver, no small talk, just a quiet nod as the door opened. Victoria got in. The ride was silent in a way that felt different from ordinary silence. Too complete, too deliberate, like a room where someone has removed all the furniture and you can feel the absence of things that should be there. She glanced at the driver once. He didn't look back, didn't speak, didn't check the mirror the way drivers normally checked mirrors. He simply drove, and the city moved past the windows in long, quiet streams of light, and Victoria sat in the back with her hands folded and the distinct and uncomfortable sensation of being inside something she hadn't fully chosen. The building was massive, all glass and precisely calibrated light. The kind of architecture that communicated money so quietly you almost didn't register it until you had already been impressed. Inside it was completely quiet. No lobby crowd, no ambient noise of other occupants, just polished floors and the soft echo of her heels, and the specific feeling of a space that had been emptied, not because it was unused, but because someone had arranged it that way for this occasion. He was already there, seated exactly where she would have expected him to be if she had thought to expect anything, as though he occupied spaces by right rather than by arrival. "You're on time," he said. "I don't like waiting," she replied. He nodded in that way he had of receiving information and filing it without comment or expression, and she had the feeling again, stronger now, that everything she said was being collected with considerable care. Dinner was perfect. Not good. Perfect, which was its own kind of unsettling. Every detail calibrated precisely, every dish arriving at exactly the right moment, the temperature of the room exactly right, the music at exactly the right volume to fill silence without demanding attention. Nothing accidental, nothing left to chance or the ordinary margin of error that attended every experience in the real world. And yet for all its perfection, or perhaps because of it, because perfection at that level requires an attention to detail that starts to feel less like hospitality and more like surveillance, something felt deeply wrong. He didn't ask questions the way people asked questions when they were getting to know someone. He didn't build warmth or establish common ground or any of the ordinary social scaffolding people erected around each other in early interactions. He watched her. There was no other word for it. The feeling of being examined sat on Victoria's skin all evening like something she could feel, but not reach to remove. "You're quiet tonight," she said at one point, more to interrupt the quality of his attention than because she wanted conversation. "I'm listening," he replied. "To what?" she said. "You," he told her. She said she wasn't talking, and he looked at her with that steady, unreadable expression and said simply, "You don't need to." She had nothing to say to that. Not because she couldn't think of a response, but because she understood with sudden, uncomfortable clarity that he meant it literally. He was receiving information from her that she was not consciously transmitting. He was reading something underneath the surface of every gesture and expression and small involuntary tell. And that realization, the specific vulnerability of being read by someone you cannot read in return, settled into her chest and did not move for the rest of the evening. After dinner he stood and moved toward the hallway without asking if she was ready. He said, "Come," and walked, and she followed, not because she was compliant. She was never compliant, but because she needed to see where this was going, because the puzzle of him was pulling at something in her she hadn't identified yet. The hallway was long and dim, the light softer here than it had been in the dining room. Shadows stretching along the walls in a way that seemed fractionally too deliberate for ordinary architecture. He stopped at a door and said this was where she would be staying. For the month. She said he hadn't mentioned that. He said he had assumed she understood, which was either genuine or a very particular kind of calculated move, and with him she genuinely could not tell the difference. She crossed her arms and told him she didn't assume. He opened the door. Inside, everything was already prepared. Clothes, shoes, accessories, all arranged with careful precision. All her style, all her size, the specific labels she preferred, the specific cuts and colors she gravitated toward, everything present with a completeness that was impossible to explain by money alone, or by any ordinary level of research or observation. Victoria walked in slowly, her fingers trailing over the fabric of a dress that fit her, she could tell without trying it on. Perfectly. This wasn't normal. This wasn't the extravagance of a wealthy man trying to impress a woman. This was the result of someone who had watched her long enough and carefully enough to know things about her that she had never told anyone. Things she had never told anyone because she had never been close enough to anyone to tell them. I need you to feel the specific wrongness of that moment. Because on the surface, it could look like care. It could look like the elaborate and romantic gesture of a man who had been paying extraordinary attention. But it wasn't care. Care doesn't feel like this. Care doesn't produce the sensation of standing in a room that was built for you before you agreed to be in it. Care doesn't make your instincts go loud in the particular way that Victoria's instincts were going loud right now. The deep, quiet alarm that lives below strategy and below pride and below the voice that says, "You're in control." This was something else. This was a cage that had been furnished with extraordinary care and attention to detail. And somewhere beneath all the armor she had constructed across 6 years of careful self-protection, Victoria knew it. She asked him how long he had been watching her. Long enough, he said, the same answer he had given the first time she asked a question he didn't want to answer, and she understood now that the repetition was not evasion, but intention. Long enough was as much information as he was prepared to give, and no amount of pressing would produce more than that. She turned to face him and asked directly, "This isn't just a deal, is it?" He met her eyes and said no. She asked what it was then. He stepped closer, not invasively, but enough to change the air between them, and told her it was an opportunity. "For what?" she said. "To see what happens," he replied, "when someone like you loses control." She held her ground and told him she didn't lose control. He said nothing to that. He simply looked at her with that still patient gaze, as though her denial was itself information he had already anticipated and logged. That night, Victoria stayed. Not because she had decided to trust him. Not because she had made peace with any of the things that were wrong about the situation. She stayed because the alternative, walking out now, forfeiting the arrangement, admitting to herself that something here was beyond her capacity to manage, felt like losing in a way she had promised herself she would never lose again. And so she lay in the unfamiliar bed and stared at the ceiling and told herself with the conviction she always brought to the things she needed to believe that she was still in control. That this was still a game she was playing on her own terms. She was still telling herself that when her phone buzzed on the nightstand beside her, unknown number, one message, "Leave now." Her heart skipped once, a single involuntary beat she couldn't suppress. She sat up in the dark. Then the second message arrived. "You don't know who he is." Victoria sat very still and looked toward the closed door of the room and listened to the silence of the building pressing in around her. And for the first time since she had walked into that restaurant, she let herself feel the thing she had been suppressing all evening. Not curiosity, not unease, fear. Real and cold and animal. She didn't move for a full minute. Just sat there in the dark with the phone in both hands and the two messages glowing on the screen and the silence of the building surrounding her with the particular completeness of a silence that has been arranged. "Leave now. You don't know who he is." Her first instinct was the instinct she always fell back on. Remain calm, do not react, think before you move. She had built her entire approach to the world on the principle that the person who controls their reactions controls the room and everything in it. But there was a different voice underneath that instinct now, quieter but more insistent. The voice that lives deeper than strategy and is harder to argue with. That voice was saying something much simpler. Something she hadn't listened to since she was young enough not to know better. It was saying, "Run." She got up carefully and crossed to the door and opened it, just a crack. The hallway outside was empty. No sound, no movement, nothing that gave her a reason to be afraid, and nothing that gave her a reason not to be. She stepped out a few paces and stood listening. The building gave her nothing back at all. She stood there in the dim light, and then her phone buzzed again. She looked down. Too late. 2 words. She stared at them for a moment, and then she felt something she had not felt in a very long time, perhaps since the last time the world had gotten through all her defenses and reached the person inside them. Her hands were shaking, not dramatically, not the way hands shook in films when something terrible was happening. Just a small, fine tremor running through her fingers that she could not make stop, regardless of how hard she tried or how firmly she applied the principle of control. 2 words. That is all it took. Too late. And those 2 words accomplished something that 6 years of dangerous situations and calculated risks and carefully constructed invulnerability had never managed to accomplish. They found the animal underneath all of it. Because too late isn't a threat. It isn't a warning you can still act on. Too late is a description of a state that already exists. Too late means the door you should have walked out of is already behind you. Too late means the thing has already started, and somewhere deeper than strategy or composure or the 6 years of armor she had built and maintained and believed in completely. Victoria understood that. She typed, "Who is this?" and waited. No reply. She went back inside and locked the door and stood against it with her back against the solid wood, trying to regulate her breathing and mostly not managing it. Something wasn't right, and not just about him. Not just about the messages, but about the entire structure of the last 48 hours. The way he had known her name before she sat down. The way the food she hadn't ordered was exactly what she would have chosen for herself. The clothes in the wardrobe in her size, in her exact taste, arranged as though someone had spent considerable time inside the private logic of who she was and how she operated. Every detail precisely right in a way that was too precise, too complete to be explained by money or research, or the kind of obsession that merely extraordinary men were capable of producing. Something else was operating here. Something with access to information no ordinary observation could have provided. She walked to the mirror and looked at her own face. The face looking back was exactly as composed as she had trained it to be. That was the particular quality of the armor. It stayed on even when everything underneath it was in pieces, which had always been its greatest utility and was only now revealing itself as a liability. "You're in control," she whispered. But even as the words left her mouth, they felt like something she was arguing toward rather than stating from. The difference between those two things had never been more apparent than it was in that moment. Standing in front of a mirror, in a room full of clothes in her size, in a building she did not know the address of. One knock at the door. Slow. Deliberate. The knock of someone who wanted you to understand that what was coming was not hurried, not anxious, but patient and considered and already decided. Then his voice, saying her name. Victoria. Calm and normal, the way someone spoke when nothing was wrong that they were going to tell you about. She walked to the door and unlocked it and opened it. And he was standing there exactly as she had found him in the restaurant, and at dinner. Composed, unreadable, watching her with those eyes that gave nothing back. He said she had left dinner early. She said she needed air. He studied her face for a moment in that way he had that felt less like looking and more like reading a document. Then said something was bothering her. She forced a small smile and told him nothing she couldn't handle. He stepped inside without asking, and while that irritated her, she did not show it because she needed him comfortable, needed him talking, needed whatever information she could gather. She asked him who else was here. He said no one. She told him that wasn't true and held up her phone. "Someone is messaging me," she said. "They told me to leave. They said I don't know who you are." He didn't react. Not in the way an innocent person would react. No surprise, no concern, no immediate reaching for an explanation. He asked what they said with the tone of someone confirming information rather than receiving it for the first time. When she told him, a silence followed. And then he smiled. And this smile was different from any he had produced across the 2 evenings she had spent with him. There was something underneath it, something that moved behind his eyes the way a current moves beneath very still water, present and powerful, and completely invisible from the surface until the moment something goes in. "And do you," he asked, "know who I am?" He walked further into the room with that same slow, unhurried movement he brought to everything, and told her she had accepted a deal without asking the most important question. "What question?" she said. He stopped and turned to face her and said, "Who is making the offer?" The room seemed to change temperature slightly. Victoria crossed her arms and told him he was just a man with money, and she said it with the particular flat certainty she used when she needed to reduce something to ordinary size, to make it manageable by refusing to grant it the dimensions it was actually occupying. He tilted his head and asked if that was really what she thought. And then her phone buzzed again. She looked down, checked the mirror. Her breath caught in a way she felt physically. A small sharp constriction in her chest that she had not felt before. "I want you to understand something about what was happening in that room." Victoria had spent 6 years being the most perceptive person in every room she occupied. She had made that her superpower, her survival strategy, her edge. She had watched people and read them and cataloged their tells with the careful attention of someone whose sense of safety depended entirely on being better at understanding people than they were at understanding her. What she was feeling right now was not confusion. It was recognition. Some deep part of her, the part that operated below words and logic and the carefully reasoned arguments she made to herself, had been trying to tell her something since the moment she walked into that restaurant. She had been too controlled, too armored, too committed to the idea that she was in this story as the one doing the watching, to listen to it. It was very loud now. She looked up slowly at the mirror across the room. Her reflection looked back at her, and his behind her, standing exactly where he was standing. Nothing unusual. Nothing that gave her a specific and expressible reason to be afraid. And then the lights flickered. Just once. A fraction of a second. A brief stutter in the electricity. But in that fraction of a second, in the mirror, there was someone else. Standing behind him in the space where no one had been standing a moment before. A figure that was there and then was not, present in the gap between one heartbeat and the next. Victoria spun around. Empty room. She turned back to the mirror. Just her reflection in his, exactly as before. Her breathing changed now, the careful regulated pattern she had maintained beginning to come apart at its edges. "What is this?" she demanded. He didn't answer. He watched her closely with an expression that had no name she knew for it. "You're not in control here," he said quietly. "I never said I was afraid," she replied automatically, because the reflex of the armor still worked even when everything else was going wrong. "You don't have to say it," he said. He stepped closer, close enough that the air between them felt different, heavier, charged in a way that had nothing to do with ordinary proximity. "You wanted a transaction," he said. "Something simple." His voice dropped. But nothing about this was ever simple. She held his gaze. Even now, even with the fear and the mirror and the figure that had been there and then wasn't, she held his gaze because holding it was the last thing she had left. "What do you want from me?" she asked. He smiled, and there was nothing human in it. "Everything," he said. Another message buzzed. She looked down. "Ask him what happened to the last one." Victoria lowered the phone slowly. "The last one," she said. And for the first time across 2 complete evenings of absolute composure, he did not answer immediately. The silence stretched, and she had her answer before any words arrived to confirm it. "The last one." The silence that followed those words was the heaviest thing in the room. Heavier than the furniture, heavier than the dark outside the windows, heavier than the fear she was now completely done pretending she wasn't feeling. For the first time since she had met him, for the first time across 2 evenings of perfect and unbroken composure, he hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. Just long enough that she caught it. And catching it was worse than if he had answered immediately and smoothly, and without missing a beat. Because a man who hesitates when you ask that question is not a man who is uncertain about the answer. He is a man who is deciding how much of the answer to give you. Victoria had been in enough conversations in her life to know exactly what that kind of hesitation meant. "Answer me," she said, and her voice was sharper now, the professional smoothness giving way to something more direct. He looked at her, and the mask shifted, just slightly. Just enough that something underneath it became briefly visible, the way something submerged becomes briefly visible when the water surface is disturbed. "You're asking questions you don't need answers to," he said quietly. Another message buzzed, and she didn't take her eyes off him this time. "Then I'll find out myself," she said. She stepped backward, creating distance between them, and felt the distance settle into her body like something physical and necessary. For the first time since this had started, she was not playing the game. She was not managing the situation, or gathering information, or positioning herself advantageously. She was looking for the door. This is the moment that separates the survivors from the others. Not the dramatic confrontation. Not the point of maximum danger. Those come later. This is the quieter moment, where a person stands in front of something and makes a clear-eyed decision about what it actually is, rather than what they have been telling themselves it is. Victoria had been standing in front of something she didn't have a name for since the moment she arrived at that restaurant. She had been classifying it as complicated, as puzzling, as interesting, as challenging in the particular way she found certain things challenging and therefore worth engaging with. She had been using every tool she had to make it into something she could manage. Standing in that room now, she was done doing that. She saw it. And she moved. "You should leave," he said. She stopped. The words took a moment to land because they were not what she expected from a man who had orchestrated every detail of this situation with such precision. "What?" she said. He repeated it without inflection, without drama, the same flat certainty he brought to everything. "You should leave." And his tone had changed. She caught it the way she caught everything. The small shifts and modulations that most people missed entirely. The control was still there. But underneath the control, just barely perceptible to someone who had been studying him for 2 days, something else. Something that might have been the closest approximation to a warning that a person like him was capable of producing. Not concern, not fear. Something colder than either of those things. The warning of something very old and very powerful, acknowledging briefly that what was coming next was beyond its interest in managing for her. Her phone buzzed. He's lying. She looked at the screen and felt her heart rate move past the point she could continue to pretend was normal. "Who are you?" she typed quickly to the unknown number. The reply came back immediately. "Someone who didn't leave." Victoria went still. Everything in her went still. Because she understood what that meant. She had understood it on some level since the second message. You don't know who he is. But she had been keeping the full implication carefully at arm's length, behind the logic and the armor and the habit of 6 years. Now it came through all of it, complete and undeniable. There had been someone before her. A woman who had received a message with a time and a location. Who had almost not gone and then had gone. Who had sat across from him in a quiet restaurant and heard the word deal and seen the number on the phone and made the same calculation Victoria had made. Who had told him she didn't lose. Who had stayed. "What happened to her?" Victoria asked, her voice very quiet now. He didn't look away from her. "She stayed," he said simply. The room felt physically colder, a drop in temperature that was not imaginary, that she felt on her arms and the back of her neck. And Victoria said, because she needed the rest of it, needed to hear it stated even though she already knew. A long pause. Long enough to be its own kind of answer. Then, she thought she was different too. That was enough. She grabbed her bag and her phone and she moved fast toward the door because the time for managing the situation and gathering information and playing this out strategically was completely and absolutely over. The only game now was out. "Victoria," he said. She stopped in the doorway but didn't turn around. Not because she was obeying anything, but because something in the tone of it, something in that single word, required acknowledgement. "If you walk out that door," he said, in that same quiet and utterly certain voice, "you don't come back." She gripped the doorframe. "I was never planning to," she said, and she walked out. The hallway was exactly as empty as it had been every time she had looked at it, but the quality of the emptiness was different now. It was the emptiness of something waiting to be filled. She walked fast, her heels ringing sharp and quick against the floor, telling herself to keep moving and not think about what was behind her. Just find the stairs. Just get down. Just get outside. Just get to the street, and then figure out the rest from there. Her phone buzzed. "Don't use the elevator." She glanced at the elevator doors. Closed. Silent, sitting with the ordinary blankness of a thing that should not produce dread but did, and turned toward the stairs without slowing down. Every step down felt like it took less time than it should, the seconds accelerating slightly, the floors compressing. Then she heard it. Above her. A door opening. Footsteps on the stairs, descending after her. Not fast. Not urgent. Steady and patient and completely unhurried. The footsteps of someone who knew the outcome of this and was simply accompanying it toward its conclusion. She ran. She was not proud of it, but she ran down the last flight and through the door at the bottom and out into the cold and the dark, and the air hit her face, and she stopped and bent forward, breathing in ragged bursts she couldn't smooth out. The street was empty. No cars, no pedestrians, no movement in either direction. Just the street and the building behind her. And the silence of a place that should have noise and didn't. I have heard people try to describe what real fear feels like. Not the manageable kind. Not the kind that makes you careful or cautious or appropriately vigilant. The real kind. The kind that takes over the body before the brain has finished processing what produced it. Victoria had built her entire life around never feeling that. Around being the kind of woman who didn't run, who didn't panic, who maintained composure because composure was the only real currency that held its value in every situation. Standing on that empty street with her heels on the pavement and her breathing all wrong and the specific terrible silence pressing in around her, she understood something she had never understood from the inside before. Composure is a choice. It depends on feeling like you have options. When the options disappear, what is left is the animal. And the animal in Victoria right now was simply trying to survive. She straightened up and looked around and her phone buzzed. Look up. She didn't want to. She looked up. One window near the top of the building was lit. A figure standing at it, looking down at exactly where she was standing, not moving, not gesturing, just there, watching her, with complete stillness, the way he had sat in that restaurant when she first arrived, as though he had always known she would be standing exactly there, at exactly this moment, looking exactly up. She turned around fast. The street behind her was empty. She turned back to the building. The figure at the window hadn't moved. She stepped backward, her mind working very fast to apply logic to something that had stepped completely outside the reach of logic. He was supposed to be behind her on the stairs. The footsteps had been above her and descending. But the figure at the window was at the top of the building, which meant he was in two places, or had moved between them by means that had no physical explanation, or something else entirely was happening that she did not have language for. Then a voice. Right behind her. Not from the building, from the street itself, directly at her back, close enough that she felt the air of it. You should have stayed. She turned. He was standing there, completely calm. Not breathing hard, not showing any trace of having moved quickly or recently, just standing in the cold, empty street with those still eyes that looked at her exactly the way they had looked at her all evening. How, she started, he said softly. You wanted control. He stepped toward her. So did she, he said. Victoria understood then with total and terrible clarity that he was not talking about a woman who had survived something and escaped. He was talking about a woman who had not. Victoria's voice came out very small. What are you? He smiled, and nothing in the smile had ever been human. Someone who gives people exactly what they think they want, he said. The streetlights flickered. Once, twice, then everything went dark. And when the lights came back, the street was empty and still and cold, and the only sound was the soft electric hum of the lights themselves. No footsteps, no voice, no Victoria. No one reported Victoria missing. And of all the terrible things in this story, that is the one that I keep returning to. Not because no one cared, but because of the specific and deliberate way she had constructed her life. The 6 years in the making, carefully engineered, entirely intentional way she had built her existence to keep everyone at the right distance. There was genuinely no one who expected to hear from her regularly enough to notice when the silence began. The men on rotation assumed she had moved on because she always moved on. Because that was the fundamental nature of what they had with her, and they had all always known it. The friends she had were acquaintances with better taste in restaurants. The family she maintained with the minimum of warmth required to avoid the kind of estrangement that would require active management. She had spent 6 years making herself untouchable. The price of being untouchable, it turned out, was being invisible to the people who might otherwise have asked where she was. I need you to sit with that. Because this is not a character judgment. This is not the story saying that Victoria deserved what happened to her because of the way she lived. She didn't deserve it. No one deserves it. This is the story saying that the choices she made, completely rational choices, made in direct and logical response to real pain, had a consequence she never calculated for. She had built herself a life so self-contained, so complete, so carefully arranged to require nothing from anyone, that when something came for her, there was genuinely no one positioned to notice. No one standing close enough to raise the alarm. She had protected herself so effectively from being hurt by people that she had also protected herself from being saved by them. And that is not a moral lesson about gold digging or materialism or any of the surface things this story is dressed in. That is a lesson about what isolation actually costs, not in the obvious ways. In the invisible ones. Weeks passed, then a month, then more. Nothing concrete emerged. No sightings, no messages from her phone, no trace of what had happened in that street when the lights went out. The men who might theoretically have asked questions didn't have enough information or enough investment to ask them in any serious way. The woman ceased to be present in the spaces she had occupied, and life, which is always somewhat indifferent to individual absences, especially carefully managed ones, simply moved around it the way water moved around a stone. And then, 6 weeks after Victoria disappeared, a profile appeared online. No name, no previous history, no digital footprint that predated its appearance by even a single day. Just videos of a woman, dark-skinned, impeccably put together, moving through luxury spaces with the specific ease of someone who did not need the luxury to confirm anything about themselves, because everything about them was already confirmed from the inside. Expensive restaurants, hotels with views, the studied, careless arrangement of beautiful things on marble surfaces that required considerable effort to make look effortless. She was beautiful and cold and completely composed. And she was winning. Whatever game this woman was playing, she was winning it, absolutely. The profile spread quickly. The way things spread when they hit the particular frequency that the internet responds to. Aspirational, aesthetic, slightly unreachable, the kind of life that looks like a destination. The comments filled with admiration and desire, and the particular online affection people extend to women who seem to have arranged themselves perfectly. She's that girl, people said. Goals, people said. Beautiful, people said. And the videos kept coming, consistent and regular, each one the same combination of luxury and cold composure and effortless winning, each one captioned identically regardless of what was in the frame. She thought she was in control. Most people read that caption as self-awareness, as the kind of reflective statement a woman makes about an earlier, less enlightened version of herself, a growth post, a before and after, where everything in the video was the after. But the women who watched closely, the ones who let the videos sit with them a little longer than the algorithm intended, who watched more than once, who noticed the details, they noticed something else. They noticed that in every single video, in the space just behind the woman's left shoulder, there was something there. A shape, a shadow, something that was never quite in focus, never quite resolvable into anything definite, that moved fractionally differently from the rest of the frame. Present. Watching, waiting, never drawing attention to itself. Just there, in every video, without exception. And some of those women, the ones who had been watching the most carefully, the ones who had let themselves feel the wrongness of the shadow rather than rationalizing it away, they began to feel something else, something they found difficult to put into words. A recognition, not of the shadow and not of the woman's face, but of something more fundamental. Her posture. The specific way she moved through rooms, the heels and the bag and the particular expression that communicated, I already own everything in this frame, and I'm simply waiting for the rest of you to acknowledge it. They had seen that walk before. They had watched a woman walk exactly like that into a restaurant at the beginning of a story. And if those women let the recognition move through them completely, without talking themselves out of it, they understood what the caption meant. Past tense. She thought she was in control. Before. And now something else was. That was Victoria. What remained of her? The part that had been preserved, the beauty, the strategy, the rules, the precise and practiced way of moving through the world that she had spent 6 years perfecting, all of that was intact. Completely. But the thing that had been running Victoria from the inside, the hurt underneath the armor, the history underneath the rules, the actual human being underneath the system, that was gone. What occupied the space it had left was something older. Something that had been doing this for far longer than Victoria ever had, and with far greater efficiency and without any of the human complications, the hesitations and second thoughts and small moments of something like conscience, that had occasionally slowed Victoria down. It didn't hesitate. It had never hesitated. It simply identified the next subject, prepared the invitation, and waited with complete and patient certainty. It always started the same way. A woman would be living her life, some version of the carefully armored, self-sufficient life that Victoria had lived. The kind of life that looks like strength and confidence from the outside, and like a very elegant and well-appointed loneliness from the inside. She would have her routines, her rules, her carefully maintained distance from anyone who might otherwise matter. She would be good at whatever she did, genuinely skilled and genuinely sharp, the kind of woman who was the most perceptive person in most rooms and who had learned to operate accordingly. She would have a story, a private one she never shared completely, about why vulnerability was a risk the potential return didn't justify, about why keeping people at the right distance was the only reliable form of self-preservation. And by every measure she had decided counted, she would be ahead. She would be winning. And then a message would arrive. No name, no greeting, no emojis or effort or any of the signals that men normally sent when they were trying to earn their way into her attention. Just a time and a location, typed out in plain text with the complete and particular absence of effort that communicated, without intending to, a total lack of interest in whether she was impressed. Something about it would snag in her in a way she didn't have a name for. She would read it and feel the slightly off-balance feeling, the one she couldn't locate or explain. She would almost not go. She would stand at her mirror, finishing getting ready, and tell herself she was simply curious, simply doing what she always did, observing before acting, gathering information before committing. She would walk out the door. This is the part I need you to hear. Because this is where the story stops being about Victoria and starts being about something much older and much larger. The thing that took Victoria didn't simply take her. It used her. It preserved everything about her that was useful, the composure, the beauty, the knowledge of exactly how to approach a woman who had decided she was untouchable, the precise understanding of the specific shape of the loneliness that such a woman carried underneath all that armor. And it sent her back out into the world with a single purpose. Find the next one. Find the woman who was, at her core, what Victoria had been. Brilliant and isolated and convinced of her own invulnerability in the specific way that made her impossible to warn and easy to trap, and make her an offer in a language she understood immediately. Clean, simple, controlled. Just a deal. 1 month, and a number on a screen. Victoria chose her subjects with precision that had nothing ordinary in it. She looked for women who were brilliant and isolated and armored in the particular way she had been armored. Not visibly, not obviously, not in a way that announced itself as loneliness, but in the way that people who had been hurt in specific ways built their lives, quietly removing everything and everyone that could reach the tender parts of them, until the life they occupied was very beautiful and very complete, and required nothing and no one at all. Women who had built lives so self-contained that their absence would require no adjustment. Women who had been so effective at protecting themselves that they had accidentally protected themselves into something that looked from the outside like perfect freedom, and from the inside, if they were honest, which they rarely were, because honesty about that particular thing was too costly. Like a very comfortable form of invisible, she would find them. She would send the message, just a time and a location, nothing else, because nothing else was necessary, and she understood that better than anyone. And she would sit in the quiet restaurant and wait with complete stillness for them to arrive. She would watch them walk in and pause at the entrance the way Victoria had paused, the way they all paused, and in that pause she would see everything she needed to see. She would tell them things about themselves that no one else knew. She would offer them exactly what they wanted, the deal, the clarity, the clean transaction, rather than the mess and risk and potential devastation of something real. She would be patient. She was always patient, and the door would close, and the cycle would move forward to the next one. The cycle continued the way it had always continued, long before Victoria, and long before any of the women who had come before her, passing from one to the next, like something being quietly handed down across time. Not with noise or drama or any of the obvious signals that would allow people to protect themselves. With a quiet restaurant, soft lighting, a person sitting perfectly still across from you who knows things about you that no one should know, who looks at you with eyes that give nothing back, who offers you the thing you have always wanted, in the cleanest and most explicit form you have ever seen it offered. The cycle continued the way all truly dangerous things continued. Not through force, through perfect understanding of exactly what you wanted, given perfectly, at exactly the right moment, until the door was closed and you never heard it shut. Right now, somewhere, a woman is sitting at a glass table with her phone in her hand, reading a message for the third time. No name, no greeting, just a time and a location. Something about it feels different from all the others. She can't explain it, can't name the quality of the difference, can't point to a single specific thing about the message that should produce the feeling she is having. But it's there. She sets the phone down, picks up her lipstick, and somewhere across the city, in a restaurant that doesn't appear on any map that anyone could find, a chair is being pulled back from a table, someone is sitting down and waiting, and already knowing she will come. I want to step outside the story for a moment. Because Victoria is not a real person. The restaurant doesn't exist on any map. What she encountered is not something you are going to find in your city on a Wednesday evening. But what the story is about, the mechanism at the very center of it, that is real. That is more real than most of the things we talk about in this format. Victoria built her life around never needing anyone. She called it control. She called it intelligence. She called it having figured out how the world actually worked, while everyone else was still operating on rules that got them hurt. And in a lot of ways, she wasn't wrong. The world does work the way she said it did in significant and painful ways. There are people who exploit openness. There are relationships that are exactly the transactions Victoria described them as. There are people who will find the vulnerable parts of you and use them against you the moment you show them. She had met those people. She had learned from them in the hard way that produces real learning. She had built her defenses in direct and logical response to real experiences that had genuinely hurt her. But here's what I want to say about armor. Armor is not the same as safety. Armor is protection from a specific category of threat. The human threat, the person who wants to hurt you in the ways that people hurt each other. What armor cannot protect you from is what it does to you on the inside over time. What it cannot protect you from is the slow and invisible accumulation of distance year after year, until the day you look around and understand that while you have been very successfully defended against being hurt, you have also very successfully removed every single person who might notice when something is wrong. Armor keeps people out. That is what it was designed to do. And it does not discriminate. It keeps out the people who would harm you and the people who would save you with exactly equal efficiency. Victoria was not taken because she was greedy. She was not punished by the universe for wanting money, or for having rules, or for making the decision to protect herself after being hurt. She was taken because she had spent 6 years building a life so completely self-contained that when something came for her, there was no one standing close enough to pull her back. The most dangerous thing in the world is not the predator. The most dangerous thing in the world is a life so carefully constructed around self-protection that you accidentally protect yourself straight into the dark. That is what I want you to carry away from this story. Not fear. Not the decision to close yourself off further. The opposite. Let people in. Not everyone. Not blindly. Not without the intelligence and discernment that Victoria had and used well. But enough. Let enough people close that someone would notice if the silence started. Let enough people in that the door stays open from both sides. Because the darkness, the real kind, the kind that has been here longer than any of us, it looks for the ones standing alone. If you made it this far, then you already know that story was something else. Drop a comment and tell me what you think really happened. I want to hear your thoughts. And tell me, are you watching from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, South Africa, Jamaica, or somewhere else entirely? Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. And before you go, check out the next one on your screen. Until next time, stay curious.